7 Johnny Carson guests who cheated on their husbands. For 30 years, Johnny Carson invited America's biggest stars into our living rooms. The Tonight Show was where celebrities came to be charming, to promote their latest projects, and to present carefully crafted public images. But beneath the light banter and practiced anecdotes often lay more complicated truths, especially when it came to matters of the heart. Carson's couch was a fascinating stage for watching how Hollywood handled infidelity, explained a former Tonight Show producer who worked with Carson for over a decade. You had these women who were involved in some of the most scandalous affairs of their era sitting there, often just months after headlines had torn apart their personal lives. Carson knew exactly what everyone at home was thinking, but he had this remarkable ability to acknowledge the elephant in the room without making his guests uncomfortable. What makes these interviews particularly compelling now is watching the delicate dance between host and guest. Carson gently probing the edges of scandal while the women navigated how much to reveal, how much to deflect, and how to reshape narratives that had been wrested from their control by tabloids and gossip columnists. These weren't just celebrity scandals, they were cultural inflection points, noted a media historian who has studied how Hollywood morality evolved through the Carson era. When Elizabeth Taylor's affair with Richard Burton was condemned by the Vatican, or when Ingrid Bergman was denounced on the floor of the U.S. Senate, these weren't just private indiscretions. They were moments when America was wrestling with changing sexual mores and women's autonomy in real time, with these actresses serving as lightning rods for cultural anxiety. In the coming minutes, we'll explore 7 of Carson's most memorable female guests whose romantic entanglements generated headlines, ended marriages, and in some cases, temporarily derailed brilliant careers. Through their Tonight Show appearances, we'll see not just personal scandals, but the evolving cultural landscape of how America viewed female sexuality, celebrity, and the institution of marriage itself. But first, we need to understand how one of the biggest box office stars of the early 1970s found herself in the middle of a love triangle that would forever alter the trajectory of her life and career, and how she later discussed it in the most public of forums, Johnny Carson's Tonight Show.
I am not talking legality, Preppy. I'm talking ethics. I mean, Harvard's got 5 million books and Radcliffe's got a few lousy...
1. Ally McGraw. Love Story's messy aftermath. When Ally McGraw sat across from Johnny Carson in the mid-1970s, she was attempting to navigate the aftermath of what had been one of Hollywood's most publicized romantic scandals. Just a few years earlier, she had been America's sweetheart, the breakout star of 1970's Love Story, a film whose famous tagline, "Love means never having to say you're sorry," would take on ironic significance in her own life. McGraw represented a particular kind of early 70s feminine ideal, explained a film historian specializing in New Hollywood cinema. She had this quality of natural, intelligent beauty that felt modern and accessible compared to the more manufactured glamour of earlier eras. Her character's death in Love Story had made America fall in love with her, and her marriage to Paramount producer Robert Evans seemed like the perfect Hollywood power union. Beautiful actress, brilliant producer, the new royalty of a changing Hollywood. This carefully constructed image began to unravel dramatically in 1972 when McGraw traveled to Texas to film The Getaway opposite Steve McQueen, then one of the biggest male stars in the world and notorious for his magnetic effect on his female co-stars. Despite McGraw's seemingly solid marriage to Evans, who was then at the height of his power as the producer behind The Godfather, the chemistry between her and McQueen proved explosive both on and off camera. The McGraw-McQueen affair wasn't just another set romance. It was a collision of 2 of the most powerful personas in early 70s cinema, noted the cultural analyst. McQueen embodied a kind of raw, rebellious masculinity that was replacing the more polished leading men of earlier eras. Evans represented old-school Hollywood power and sophistication. McGraw found herself caught between these 2 archetypes at a moment when American definitions of marriage, fidelity, and female autonomy were all in dramatic flux. As the affair became public, McGraw made the difficult decision to leave Evans for McQueen, eventually marrying the actor in 1973. This choice came at considerable professional cost. Evans had been not just her husband, but a powerful career ally who had helped shape her star image. By choosing McQueen, she was effectively choosing love over career strategy at a crucial juncture in her professional trajectory. When McGraw appeared on Carson's show after all this had played out, There's a palpable sense of a woman trying to reclaim her own narrative, observed the television historian who has studied these appearances. Carson never directly mentions the scandal, but there's this subtle acknowledgement hanging in the air. He treats her with remarkable respect, focusing on her talent and her current projects rather than defining her by the men in her life, which was refreshingly rare for that era. What makes these interviews particularly poignant in retrospect is that McGraw's marriage to McQueen would prove even more volatile and constraining than her relationship with Evans. McQueen, threatened by her success and independence, reportedly pressured her to abandon her career to focus on being his wife. The marriage lasted just 5 years, ending in 1978 as McQueen's controlling behavior and infidelities made the relationship untenable. McGraw's Carson appearances throughout the 70s and early 80s document this evolution in real time, said the media analyst. You can see her initially somewhat defensive about her choices, then gradually more reflective as the McQueen marriage deteriorates, and finally embracing a kind of hard-won wisdom in her later appearances. Carson gave her the space to present herself as a complete human being rather than just the woman who left Robert Evans for Steve McQueen, which was how much of the press continued to define her. In her later, more candid interviews with Carson, McGraw subtly addressed the power dynamics that had shaped her romantic decisions without directly discussing the affairs themselves. She spoke of finding herself and establishing independence after years of defining herself through relationships with powerful men, offering a narrative of personal growth that resonated with many women navigating changing gender expectations in the 1970s. What's remarkable about McGraw's evolution across her Carson appearances is how it mirrors the journey many women were taking during that decade, concluded the cultural historian. From being defined by relationships with men to claiming agency and independence, her story resonated far beyond Hollywood. Carson, to his credit, seemed to recognize the cultural significance of this transition and gave her the platform to express it in her own words and on her own terms.
Nobody's good, but Brick Skipper is dead, and I'm alive!
Maggie!
2. Elizabeth Taylor, the scandal that changed Hollywood. When Elizabeth Taylor occasionally graced Johnny Carson's couch, she brought with her not just movie star glamour, but the weight of having survived and transcended perhaps the most notorious romantic scandal of the 20th century. Taylor's affair with Richard Burton on the set of Cleopatra in 1962 wasn't just tabloid fodder, it was a global sensation that drew condemnation from the Vatican, sparked international headlines, and forever changed how celebrity private lives would be covered by the media. The Taylor-Burton affair represents a watershed moment in celebrity culture, explained a Hollywood historian specializing in studio-era stars. Before this scandal, the studios had maintained tight control over stars' images, with publicists and fixers ensuring that private indiscretions remained private. The sheer magnitude of Taylor and Burton's passion, combined with the unprecedented media attention surrounding the troubled production of Cleopatra, made it impossible to contain. Their affair essentially broke the studio publicity system and ushered in the modern era of celebrity coverage. What made Taylor's situation particularly explosive was the complex web of relationships involved. She was married to singer Eddie Fisher, who had himself left America's sweetheart Debbie Reynolds to be with Taylor just a few years earlier. That previous scandal had already tarnished Taylor's reputation, with much of the public viewing her as a home wrecker. Burton, meanwhile, was married to Sybil Williams, his wife of many years. The affair between these two intensely charismatic, already controversial figures created a perfect storm of public fascination and moral outrage. The level of public condemnation Taylor faced would be almost unimaginable today, noted the cultural analyst. She was declared a homewrecker, a sexual vagrant, and morally unfit in mainstream publications. The Vatican issued a statement accusing her of erotic vagrancy. Members of Congress spoke out against her. There were calls to ban her films. For a brief period, she was arguably the most controversial woman in the world, all for following her heart in ways that male stars had been doing with relative impunity for decades. By the time Taylor appeared on Carson's show in the 1970s, and her legendary solo appearance in 1992, she had not only survived this intense period of scrutiny, but had emerged as a figure who had effectively transcended conventional moral judgment. Her passionate relationship with Burton, which led to 2 marriages and 2 divorces between them, had become part of her mystique rather than a source of shame. Carson, recognizing both her legendary status and her hard-won wisdom, engaged with her as someone who had lived life on her own terms, regardless of the consequences. Carson's approach to Taylor was fascinating, observed the television historian. He treated her with a kind of reverence that acknowledged she was playing by different rules than ordinary mortals. There was never any hint of moral judgment about her complicated romantic history, but rather an appreciation for her honesty about the messiness of love and passion. This represented a significant evolution in how female celebrities who had defied conventional morality were treated in mainstream media. What makes Taylor's Carson appearances particularly meaningful is how they capture her in the later phases of her remarkable life, not just as the beautiful movie star whose passions had scandalized the world, but as a woman who had channeled her experiences into humanitarian causes, particularly her groundbreaking advocacy for AIDS research at a time when many celebrities avoided the issue entirely. Taylor's journey from scandalous figure to respected humanitarian represents a particular kind of American redemption narrative, explained the cultural historian. Her Carson appearances document this evolution, from being defined primarily by her romantic entanglements to being appreciated for her substance, resilience, and compassion. Carson, by focusing on her complete personhood rather than just her romantic history, helped facilitate this more nuanced public understanding of a woman who had long been reduced to tabloid caricature. For modern viewers, Taylor's Tonight Show appearances offer a fascinating glimpse of a woman who had not only survived public crucifixion for her romantic choices, but had ultimately forced society to accept her on her own terms. A woman who, when asked if she would marry again after 7 marriages, could laugh and say, "No, I'll just find a man I don't like and give him a house," with the earned confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone.
Also has 3 teenagers, would you believe that?
Wow.
Good comment.
You like that, huh?
Wow, would you welcome Joan Collins?
3. Joan Collins. Unapologetic romance on her own terms. When Joan Collins settled into Johnny Carson's guest chair throughout the 1970s and 1980s, she brought with her a refreshingly unapologetic approach to discussing her colorful romantic history. Unlike some celebrities who preferred to keep their private lives private, or who approached past indiscretions with careful contrition, Collins spoke about her numerous relationships, including affairs conducted during her marriages, with a frankness that was both shocking and oddly refreshing for the era. Collins represented a particular kind of female sexual autonomy that was ahead of its time, explained a media historian who has studied changing presentations of female sexuality in television. While many female stars of her generation were still playing by the rules of traditional propriety in public, even if their private lives were quite different, Collins brought a European sensibility to American television. She discussed her affairs not with shame, but with the matter-of-factness of someone who viewed passion as a natural part of life, regardless of whether it happened to occur within the bounds of marriage. This openness was particularly evident when Collins appeared on Carson to promote her various autobiographies, which detailed relationships with numerous men, including affairs with stars like Ryan O'Neal during her marriage to Anthony Newley. Rather than positioning these extramarital relationships as mistakes or moral failings, Collins framed them as natural responses to the constraints and disappointments of marriages that were no longer fulfilling. What made Collins' Carson appearances so compelling was the absence of apology in her discussions of infidelity, noted the cultural analyst. She once famously quipped that if a husband wasn't giving her what she needed, she would find it elsewhere, a statement that would have been career suicide for many female stars, but that Collins delivered with such charm and self-possession that audiences found themselves nodding along rather than judging. Carson's response to Collins's candor revealed his own evolving approach to female sexuality and autonomy. Rather than expressing shock or disapproval, he engaged with her as an equal, someone whose romantic choices might be unconventional, but were fundamentally her own business. This represented a significant shift from how scarlet women had traditionally been treated in mainstream media, where a narrative of sin and redemption was typically required before forgiveness could be granted. The Collins-Carson dynamic captured a particular moment in American sexual politics, observed the television historian. Carson, despite his Midwestern background and conventional public persona, was actually quite progressive in his willingness to treat sexually autonomous women with respect rather than judgment. Collins, with her British sophistication and refusal to play by American rules of female propriety, helped normalize conversations about female desire and agency that were still relatively rare on network television. What makes Collins' Tonight Show appearances particularly valuable now is how they document a woman claiming control of her own narrative around infidelity, refusing to be defined as either victim or villain in the complex emotional landscapes of her relationships. When discussing affairs that had occurred during her marriages, she contextualized them not as moral failures, but as human responses to emotional needs that weren't being met within the formal boundaries of matrimony. Collins pioneered a particular kind of female celebrity memoir, one that didn't position extramarital relationships as shameful secrets, but as meaningful parts of a complete life, explained the literary historian who has studied celebrity autobiographies. When she appeared on Carson to promote these books, she was effectively modeling a new way for women to discuss their romantic histories, with ownership, perspective, and even humor, rather than the performance of regret that society typically demanded from women who had strayed from their marriage vows. For viewers of these interviews today, what's most striking is how modern Collins' approach feels compared to many of her contemporaries. In an era when female stars were still often expected to express appropriate remorse for romantic mistakes, Collins instead offered a vision of female sexuality that was autonomous, unapologetic, and fundamentally on her own terms, a perspective that would eventually become more mainstream, but that in the 1970s and early 1980s still felt revolutionary, especially coming from a woman in her 40s and 50s rather than a young starlet. Collins' lasting contribution through her Carson appearances was helping to destigmatize female infidelity by refusing to accept the double standard that judged women's extramarital relationships more harshly than men's, concluded the cultural historian. By discussing her affairs with the same light-hearted charm that male stars had long used when hinting at their own romantic exploits, she helped create space for women to be the heroes of their own sexual narratives rather than being defined by their adherence to or deviation from conventional marital expectations.
How are you?
Oh, I'm doing all right.
You look wonderful.
It's good to see you again.
Really?
4. Sybil Shepherd, the other woman, becomes the star. When Sybil Shepherd began appearing on Johnny Carson's show in the 1970s, she was navigating the complex transition from being perceived as the other woman in one of Hollywood's most talked-about affairs to establishing herself as a legitimate star in her own right. Her relationship with director Peter Bogdanovich, which began during the filming of The Last Picture Show in 1971, while he was still married to his collaborator Polly Platt, had thrust her into the spotlight for reasons that threatened to overshadow her considerable talents as an actress. Shepherd's situation was particularly complicated because the Bogdanovich-Platt marriage wasn't just any Hollywood union, explained a film historian specializing in 1970s New Hollywood. Polly Platt wasn't just Bogdanovich's wife, she was his creative partner, the production designer whose visual sensibility had been crucial to his early successes. When Shepherd entered the picture as a 21-year-old former model starring in her first film, the narrative quickly became one of the young beauties stealing not just a husband, but disrupting one of the most productive creative partnerships in the New Hollywood movement. What makes Shepherd's Carson appearances particularly interesting is how they document her efforts to reshape this reductive narrative and assert her own agency and talent beyond being defined by this relationship. Throughout multiple Tonight Show visits in the 1970s and 1980s, including stints as a guest host, viewers can watch Shepherd gradually reclaiming her public image, moving from being somewhat defensive about her personal choices to speaking with increasing confidence about her career achievements and artistic ambitions. Carson gave Shepherd something crucial that much of the media denied her: the opportunity to be seen as a complete person rather than just the woman who broke up the Bogdanoviches, noted the television historian. He engaged with her intelligence, her humor, and her professional accomplishments rather than defining her by her romantic choices. This approach was particularly significant given how thoroughly the press had reduced her to a one-dimensional homewrecker stereotype when she first came to prominence. As her appearances on the show continued throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, Shepherd became increasingly candid about her complicated romantic history, including relationships with Elvis Presley and others. However, she framed these experiences not as scandalous indiscretions, but as part of a young woman's journey toward self-discovery in an industry that often treated beautiful women as commodities, rather than complete human beings. What's fascinating about watching Shepard's evolution across her Carson appearances is how it parallels broader cultural shifts in how female sexuality was discussed publicly, observed the cultural analyst. In her earlier appearances, there's a palpable caution, the sense of a woman who knows she's been branded by scandal and is carefully managing her image. By the later appearances, there's a new confidence and openness, reflecting changing social mores that allowed women greater freedom to discuss their romantic lives without automatic moral condemnation. This evolution reached its apex with the publication of Shepard's candid autobiography and her subsequent Carson appearance to promote it, where she discussed her various relationships with a refreshing combination of honesty, humor, and perspective. Rather than positioning herself as either victim or villain in these complex romantic entanglements, she presented herself as a woman who had made choices, some wise, some less so, in her journey toward authentic selfhood. By the time of her later Carson appearances, Shepard had effectively rewritten her own narrative, explained the media historian. She was no longer the beautiful model who broke up a marriage, but an accomplished actress with a substantial career, a mother, and a woman who had earned the right to tell her own story on her own terms. Carson, to his credit, facilitated this evolution by consistently treating her as a peer, worthy of respect, rather than as the subject of scandal. For modern viewers, Shepard's Tonight Show appearances offer a fascinating case study in how a female celebrity could gradually reclaim narrative control after being defined by a relationship that had initially threatened to limit her to a reductive stereotype. Through intelligence, persistence, talent, and the platform Carson provided, Shepard demonstrated that women could eventually transcend even the most limiting labels that the press and public initially assigned them.
Everything in the universe can be explained by the laws of cause and effect. There is no accident. That's coming from Stephen Hawking.
5. Shirley MacLaine, redefining marriage on national television. When Shirley MacLaine settled into Johnny Carson's guest chair, something she did dozens of times throughout his tenure, she brought not just her considerable charm and talent, but a perspective on marriage and fidelity that was revolutionary for mainstream television. Unlike other female guests who might have had affairs outside their marriages, but discussed them discreetly if at all, MacLaine openly advocated for a completely different paradigm, the consensually open marriage that she maintained with her husband Steve Parker for nearly 3 decades. MacLaine wasn't just admitting to affairs, she was challenging the entire premise that monogamy was the only valid approach to marriage, explained a cultural historian specializing in changing sexual mores of the 20th century. While she was married to businessman Steve Parker from 1954 to 1982, they lived primarily on different continents. She in America pursuing her career, he in Japan pursuing his business interests. They openly allowed each other to have other relationships, an arrangement MacLaine credited with giving their marriage the longevity it had. What made MacLaine's Carson appearances particularly groundbreaking was her matter-of-fact discussion of this arrangement at a time when open marriages were still considered not just unconventional, but morally suspect by much of mainstream America. Rather than approaching the topic with defensiveness or presenting it as a concession to human weakness, MacLaine positioned their arrangement as a thoughtful, mature response to the realities of human desire and the particular challenges of a bicontinental relationship between two independent people. Carson's response to MacLaine's candor about her open marriage revealed his own sophistication and willingness to allow his platform to introduce challenging ideas to Middle America, noted the television historian. He never expressed shock or moral judgment when MacLaine mentioned having lovers outside her marriage or when she referenced her husband's other relationships. Instead, he engaged with her perspective curiously and respectfully, effectively normalizing a relationship structure that much of his audience would have initially found alien or even threatening. MacLaine's comfort in discussing what most celebrities would have considered deeply private matters stemmed partly from her spiritual and philosophical explorations, which had led her to question many conventional Western approaches to relationships and sexuality. Her interest in Eastern philosophies and alternative spiritual traditions informed her view that possessiveness and exclusivity weren't necessary components of a loving, committed partnership. What made McLean unique among Carson's female guests who had relationships outside their marriages was that she refused to accept the framework of cheating altogether, observed the cultural analyst. While others might have presented extramarital relationships as lapses, mistakes, or responses to problems within the marriage, McLean rejected the premise that romantic or sexual exclusivity was an inherent or necessary part of the marital contract. This perspective was radical for network television in that era and introduced millions of viewers to relationship models they might never otherwise have encountered. The longevity of McLean's marriage, which outlasted many of her contemporaries' supposedly monogamous unions, gave her additional credibility when discussing alternative relationship structures. She could point to her nearly 3-decade partnership with Parker as evidence that allowing each other freedom didn't necessarily threaten commitment, but could potentially strengthen it by removing unrealistic expectations and the deceptions that often accompanied them. McLean's Tonight Show appearances represented a unique moment in the sexual revolution, explained the media historian. While much of the discussion around changing sexual mores in the 1960s and 1970s focused on young people rejecting traditional values, McLean offered something different, a mature woman in a long-term marriage thoughtfully articulating an alternative approach to commitment that honored both partnership and individual freedom. This wasn't rebellion for its own sake, but a considered philosophy of relationships that prioritized honesty over convention. For viewers revisiting these interviews today, what's particularly striking is how McLean's perspective, once considered shocking and radical, has become increasingly mainstream in contemporary discussions of polyamory, relationship anarchy, and other non-traditional approaches to partnership. Her Carson appearances document a woman who was decades ahead of her time in questioning relationship norms that most of her contemporaries accepted without examination. McLean used her Carson platform to expand the American conversation about marriage at a time when few celebrities were willing to challenge such fundamental institutions, concluded the cultural historian. By discussing her open marriage, not as a scandalous secret, but as a thoughtful life choice, she helped create space for others to question whether the traditional model of marriage was the only valid approach to long-term commitment. This contribution to the cultural dialogue may ultimately prove as significant as her considerable artistic achievements.
Actually, I have difficulty sleeping.
6. Judy Garland. Tragedy behind the legend. When Judy Garland appeared on The Tonight Show in 1968, just months before her death, viewers witnessed a legend in the twilight of her tumultuous life. Her visibly frail condition and somewhat erratic behavior during this appearance gave little indication of the complex romantic history that had contributed to her troubled existence, including affairs that had ended marriages and created scandals decades earlier. Garland's 1968 Carson appearance is heartbreaking to watch now, explained an entertainment historian specializing in Golden Age Hollywood. She was only 46, but appeared much older, worn down by decades of substance abuse, financial troubles, and emotional turmoil that stemmed partly from her complicated romantic life. Behind that fragile figure was a woman whose search for stability and love had led her through 5 marriages and numerous affairs, including one that had created a significant scandal when she was still married to director Vincente Minnelli. That particular infidelity had occurred in the late 1940s when Garland, struggling with both her mental health and her increasingly difficult relationship with Minnelli, began an affair with Sid Luft, who was then her tour manager. The relationship with Luft quickly became serious, and Garland became pregnant with his child while still legally married to Minnelli, a situation that, while not unprecedented in Hollywood, still generated considerable gossip and judgment in the more restrictive moral climate of the post-war era. Garland's affair with Luft wasn't just another Hollywood indiscretion, noted the cultural analyst. It represented her desperate search for someone who could both love her and manage the increasingly chaotic reality of her career and personal life. Minnelli was a brilliant director, but wasn't equipped to handle Garland's escalating substance abuse issues and emotional instability. Luft, more pragmatic and hands-on, seemed to offer both romantic passion and practical support, a combination Garland had rarely found in her relationships. The pregnancy led to Garland's divorce from Minnelli and her subsequent marriage to Luft, with whom she would have 2 children and remain married for 13 years, her longest union. Despite the relative longevity of the marriage, it too was marked by turmoil, including Luft's gambling problems, Garland's continued substance issues, and mutual infidelities that created additional strain on an already complicated relationship. By the time Garland sat across from Carson in 1968, she had been through 5 marriages and countless disappointments, observed the television historian. What makes this appearance particularly poignant is Carson's gentle, protective approach. He seems acutely aware of her fragility and steers the conversation towards safe topics, giving her the space to shine despite her obvious struggles. There's no mention of her complicated romantic history, just a respectful engagement with the legend sitting before him. This protective approach reflected Carson's understanding that Garland's value lay not in the scandals or struggles of her personal life, but in her extraordinary talent and the emotional connection she had maintained with audiences since her days as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. Unlike some hosts who might have probed for sensational details about her marriages and affairs, Carson chose to focus on her achievements and ongoing creative endeavors. Carson's treatment of Garland exemplifies his ability to adjust his interviewing approach to the specific needs of his guests, explained the media analyst. With someone like Joan Collins or Shirley MacLaine, who discussed their complicated romantic lives openly and with confidence, he engaged directly with those topics. With Garland, clearly vulnerable and struggling, he created a safe space that acknowledged her dignity rather than her difficulties. This flexibility was part of what made him such an extraordinary interviewer. For viewers today, Garland's Carson appearance serves as a poignant reminder of how the pursuit of love and stability often proved elusive for even the most talented women in Hollywood's golden era. The infidelities that had once generated headlines are now understood as part of a larger pattern of a troubled woman seeking connection and security in an industry and era that offered female stars precious little of either. Garland's story reminds us that behind the scandalous headlines about affairs and broken marriages often lay genuine human pain and longing, concluded the historian. Her relationships, including the affair with Luft that ended her marriage to Minnelli, weren't just celebrity gossip material, but attempts to find love and support in a life that had been marked by exploitation since childhood. Carson's respectful treatment of her in what would be one of her final television appearances acknowledged the humanity behind the headlines, a courtesy that much of the press had rarely extended to her throughout her troubled life.
No longer bodies, but pure aesthetic images, compared to which mere thought seems.
7. Ingrid Bergman. Exile and Redemption. When Ingrid Bergman appeared on Johnny Carson's show in the 1970s, she represented one of the most dramatic examples of how infidelity could derail a brilliant career, and how, with sufficient time and changing social mores, even the most scandalized star could eventually find redemption in the public eye. Few Hollywood scandals had ever reached the fever pitch of Bergman's affair with Italian director Roberto Rossellini, which had transformed her from America's most beloved actress to a moral pariah virtually overnight. Bergman's fall from grace in 1950 was unprecedented in its severity, explained a film historian specializing in studio-era Hollywood. Prior to her affair with Rossellini, she had embodied a particular kind of luminous dignity on screen, the woman whose characters in films like Casablanca and Notorious made difficult choices with grace and intelligence. When news broke that she had become pregnant with Rossellini's child while still married to her first husband, Petter Lindstrom, the public reaction was swift and brutal. The contrast between her screen image and her personal choices created a sense of betrayal that went beyond typical celebrity scandal. The intensity of the backlash against Bergman reflected not just the moral standards of the era, but the particular pedestal on which she had been placed. Unlike stars with sexier or more troubled images, who might have weathered similar revelations with less damage, Bergman had been marketed and embraced as the antithesis of Hollywood artifice, a natural, authentic presence whose characters often embodied moral strength and sacrifice. The revelation of her affair and pregnancy was treated not just as a personal indiscretion, but almost as a public deception. The reaction went far beyond typical celebrity gossip, noted the cultural analyst. Bergman was denounced from the floor of the United States Senate, with Senator Edwin C. Johnson of Colorado calling her a powerful influence for evil and Hollywood's apostle of degradation. The major studios blacklisted her, her films were boycotted, and she was effectively exiled from American cinema for nearly 7 years. All this because she had fallen in love with a director become pregnant, and chosen not to hide these facts from the public. What made Bergman's case particularly remarkable was her refusal to express public remorse or to hide from the consequences of her choices. Rather than attempting to mitigate the scandal through publicist-crafted apologies or strategic privacy, she acknowledged her relationship with Rossellini openly, married him after obtaining a divorce from Lindstrom, and built a new life in Europe, where she continued to make films with her new husband, despite being shut out of Hollywood. When Bergman returned to Carson's show in the 1970s, more than 2 decades after the scandal that had once defined her public image, she projected a quiet dignity that reflected her journey, observed the television historian. Carson approached the topic of her exile and return with sensitivity, but didn't shy away from acknowledging this significant chapter in her life. Their conversation reflected how thoroughly American attitudes toward infidelity and female sexuality had evolved since the height of the scandal in 1950. Bergman's eventual return to Hollywood's good graces had begun with her Oscar-winning performance in Anastasia, 1956. A testament to the enduring power of her talent, despite the moral outrage that had once made her untouchable in American cinema. By the time of her Carson appearances, she had been fully rehabilitated in the public eye, not through performative contrition, but through the simple passage of time and the undeniable quality of her work. What makes Bergman's story particularly significant is how it illuminates changing attitudes toward female infidelity across decades, explained the media historian. The moral condemnation that had once seemed absolute and permanent eventually gave way to a more nuanced understanding of human relationships and a recognition that personal choices shouldn't negate extraordinary professional contributions. Carson's respectful engagement with Bergman in the 1970s symbolized this cultural evolution, treating her as the distinguished artist she was, rather than defining her by a personal choice that had once made her a national pariah. For viewers of these interviews, Bergman's quiet confidence and lack of bitterness about her